In 1832, a mute slave confessed to murder, but what he wrote freed 40 captives from death. The year was 1832. In the thick, suffocating heat of a southern plantation, silence was often the only language left to those who'd been stripped of everything else. But one man, known only as Isaac, carried a silence deeper than most. He had no voice. His tongue had been cut years before, a punishment for daring to warn another slave of an impending beating. Since then, Isaac spoke through the scratch of charcoal and the language of his eyes. For years, he worked beneath the gaze of a cruel overseer, his back bearing the scars of 1,000 unspoken words. The nights were filled with whispers, rumors of rebellion, of runaways who vanished into the swamps, of spirits who haunted the tunnels beneath the earth. Yet even in this world of fear and superstition, Isaac's silence was more haunting than any ghost story. Because one night, he began to write. It started as a confession that would terrify the masters and bewilder the lawmen who came to read it. On a piece of rough parchment smuggled from the plantation's ledger room, Isaac drew symbols, words, and phrases that told of a murder. The victim, a man of high standing, a landowner, a pillar of the local church. And the killer, according to Isaac's trembling hand, was himself. But what he wrote next turned that confession into something far more extraordinary. He didn't describe the act of killing. He described why it happened and what it uncovered. His written confession was not just an admission of guilt, but a map, a warning, and a message encrypted with truths that could shatter the illusion of justice in the antebellum South. He named the hidden tunnels where slaves were imprisoned beneath the fields, the secret gatherings of men who called themselves keepers of faith, and the chambers where those who disobeyed were never seen again. Isaac's parchment was delivered to the local sheriff, alongside his trembling body dragged in chains. He could not speak to defend himself. He could only watch as the words he had written were read aloud before the court, his life balancing on every line of ink. And yet something strange happened as they read. The words did not only accuse, they revealed. The more the officials tried to use his confession to condemn him, the more it exposed those who had kept their sins buried beneath the soil of their estates. By the end of the trial, Isaac's fate seemed sealed. A mute slave confessing to murder in 1832 had no hope of mercy. But as the court prepared to deliver its sentence, a voice rose from the back of the hall. A trembling voice belonging to a freed woman named Ruth, who carried a small wooden box. Inside it were fragments of parchment, smuggled pieces of Isaac's earlier writings. Each contained details that matched missing persons cases, plantation disappearances, and the names of those who had died accidentally over the years. Suddenly, the room shifted. The silence cracked open. The magistrate who had once called Isaac a liar now ordered an investigation into the tunnels described in his confession. What they found beneath those fields would freeze even the most hardened hearts. 40 captives, half-starved, beaten, waiting in darkness, alive. Isaac's supposed confession had not been a plea for forgiveness. It had been a message in blood and ink, a sacrifice meant to expose the truth no one dared to speak. His voice, though stolen, had found another way to scream, and that was only the beginning. Because what the Sheriff's men uncovered next in those tunnels would lead them to question not just Isaac's story, but the entire foundation of the town's history itself. Before we step into those tunnels, remember this. Every word you're about to hear was once written by a man who could not speak. And by the end of this story, you'll understand how his silence became the loudest cry for freedom history ever tried to forget. If you think you've heard dark tales before, believe me, this one will change the way you look at every hidden page of the past. And when you stay until the very end, you'll hear the part of Isaac's message that was never meant to be revealed to the world. Stay with me. What he wrote was not just a confession, it was a prophecy. The year 1832 was a time of trembling uncertainty in the American South. The echoes of rebellion whispered through cotton fields and along the banks of rivers that carried both commerce and corpses. The Nat Turner Revolt had erupted just months before, spreading terror among slave-holding states. Every plantation owner looked upon his laborers with suspicion. Every whispered word could mean conspiracy, and every silence carried the weight of danger. It was a world ruled by fear, religion, and the whip, where the smallest act of defiance could summon unspeakable punishment. The plantation where Isaac lived stood on the outskirts of St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, a place where mist hung heavy over the fields at dawn, and the air carried the smell of wet earth and sorrow. Locals spoke of strange lights in the night, flickering near the marshes, and of sounds, muffled cries that drifted from beneath the soil when the moon was full. Most dismissed them as superstition, the kind of ghost tales that kept children close to the hearth. But others whispered that the ground itself held secrets, that something beneath those fields was alive and listening. The main house loomed like a monument to cruelty. Pale walls, stained by humidity, windows shuttered tight even in the heat of summer. Inside, portraits of ancestors glared down from cracked frames, their painted eyes following every servant who dared to cross the hall. Behind those walls, decisions were made that shaped the fate of hundreds. Men in polished boots spoke of profit and progress, while others rotted in the dark below. It was said that the plantation's foundation was unlike any other. Beneath it stretched a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers, some used for storage, others for something more sinister. No one knew who built them or why they went so deep. Slaves spoke of hearing voices echoing through the floors at night, of chains rattling even when no one was there. One overseer claimed that the tunnels were remnants of old French cellars. Another said they were burial vaults. But those who ventured too far inside never returned. And so, the tunnels became both myth and warning, a place where secrets were buried alongside the dead. The world outside was changing too. Across the Atlantic, the British Empire had abolished slavery just a year earlier. Rumors of freedom spread like wildfire, carried encoded hymns and whispered stories among the enslaved. Yet, for those trapped in the American South, hope was a dangerous flame. It drew attention, and attention drew blood. The more the idea of liberty grew, the harsher the punishments became. Isaac had seen it all. He had watched men broken for less than a glance, women taken to teach obedience, children sold to erase the memory of defiance. And in that endless silence of his, he learned to observe. He saw what others ignored, the ledgers hidden behind false panels, the strange visitors who arrived at night, dressed not as traders, but as preachers, the symbols carved into the wooden beams beneath the attic floor. There were whispers of a secret brotherhood that met in the dead of night, a gathering of planters, sheriffs, and judges who called themselves the Circle of Redemption. They claimed to be God-fearing men, sworn to preserve order in a world they believed was descending into chaos. But their faith was forged in cruelty. Their meetings were said to involve rituals, prayers whispered in Latin, offerings of blood, and vows sealed in darkness. Isaac's master, Reverend Elijah Moore, was among them. To the outside world, he was a man of scripture, a preacher who spoke of salvation and grace. But in the candlelit chambers beneath his estate, salvation had another name. Those who entered the tunnels to repent often did not come back. The townspeople felt it too. There was something unnatural about the Moore plantation. Animals avoided its boundaries. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing the tree line. Travelers told stories of figures standing motionless among the fields at dusk, watching, waiting. And then came the disappearance of a young overseer, Thomas Hale. One night, he simply vanished. Some said he had fled after stealing from the reverend. Others claimed he had stumbled upon something he was never meant to see. But when Isaac's confession surfaced weeks later, written in trembling charcoal strokes, it named Hale as the man he had murdered. The news spread like wildfire. How could a mute slave, who could barely write, describe with such precision the room where Hale had died, a room no one outside the circle was ever allowed to enter? And how could he know of the others who had gone missing over the years? The sheriff dismissed it as madness. The townsfolk called it witchcraft. But one thing was certain. Isaac's confession had cracked open something far older, far darker than anyone could comprehend. Picture it now, the heat rising from the ground, the hum of cicadas dissolving into silence, and beneath your feet, an entire network of tunnels breathing like a living thing. Down there, in the choking dark, the truth waited, and soon someone would be brave or foolish enough to go down and face it. Isaac was not born into silence. He was forced into it. As a child, he had been known for his laughter, for the songs he hummed while gathering water or sweeping the dirt paths between cabins. But one night, when he was barely 12, he tried to warn an older slave of an ambush the overseers were planning. The next morning, his voice was gone forever. They called it punishment. To him, it was the birth of another kind of language, one written in pain, in patience, in observation. He learned to listen the way others breathed. Every footstep, every whisper between masters, every flicker of fear among his people became part of a silent code he could read with terrifying clarity. He became invisible, a ghost in the living world, present in every room but never truly seen. And yet, those who knew Isaac spoke of his eyes. They said he carried storms in them, storms that never broke but promised destruction all the same. Even without a voice, he became a kind of legend among the slaves. They called him the Silent One, and when something strange or unexplainable happened on the plantation, people wondered if he had somehow caused it. But Isaac was not alone. There was Ruth, a freedwoman who worked as a healer and midwife for both slaves and poor white families in the area. She had once belonged to the same plantation, but had purchased her freedom years earlier, carrying the scars of the whip across her shoulders as reminders of what freedom truly cost. Ruth visited the quarters often, bringing herbs, whispered blessings and hope. Some said she and Isaac could communicate without words, that she could read his thoughts just by watching his hands. Then there was Reverend Elijah Moore, the master, a man whose voice could bring an entire church to tears on Sunday morning, yet whose hands were stained with the blood of his own flock by nightfall. To the town, he was the pillar of morality. To those beneath his roof, he was the architect of nightmares. His sermons spoke of redemption, yet his soul was a ledger of sin, balanced only by fear. His son, Nathaniel Moore, had inherited neither his father's faith nor his cruelty. Nathaniel was quiet, almost timid, and often seen wandering the edges of the property with a journal in hand. He sketched the fields, the workers, even Isaac. While his father preached of obedience, Nathaniel wrote about injustice, secretly, in pages no one else ever saw. But as the years passed, he grew more distant, his eyes darker. Something had shifted in him, something Ruth once called the weight of seeing too much. And finally, there was Thomas Hale, the overseer who vanished. Young, ambitious, and vicious in ways that pleased Reverend Moore, Hale ruled the fields with his whip and his smirk. Yet behind that cruelty, there was a hint of fear. He was seen more than once descending into the tunnels at night, clutching a lantern and muttering prayers. Some believed he was helping with the Reverend's secret gatherings. Others whispered that he was trying to escape from something only he had seen. It was this fragile constellation of souls, Isaac, Ruth, Nathaniel, Moore, and Hale, that set the stage for what would unfold. Each carried secrets, each bore scars. and all of them were bound together by threads of guilt and silence that stretched deep into the earth beneath their feet. One humid evening, when the air hung thick with the scent of cane and decay, Ruth found Isaac sitting outside his cabin, his hands blackened with charcoal. He had been writing on the wall, symbols, not words, circles, crosses, and strange marks that looked almost like eyes. She asked him what they meant. Isaac looked at her, tears glinting in the firelight, and pointed toward the big house. That night, Hale disappeared. In the days that followed, the plantation became a cauldron of fear. The Reverend prayed louder than ever. Nathaniel stopped sketching. The slaves whispered of curses, of justice coming from the grave. But Ruth knew better. She knew Isaac was not cursed. He was preparing something that had been building for years, word by word, mark by mark. When she returned a week later, Isaac handed her a folded piece of parchment. On it were trembling lines, part confession, part prophecy. At the bottom, written with deliberate care, were 3 words that chilled her blood. He will answer. Ruth didn't understand then who he was, or what Isaac was truly planning. But deep down, she felt it. The story they were living had already been written, and every breath they took was just bringing them closer to its end. And somewhere beneath them, the tunnels waited, their walls breathing with secrets too heavy for the living to hold. The morning after Thomas Hale vanished, the plantation awoke in uneasy silence. The fields, usually alive with the rhythmic sound of labor and the crack of the overseer's whip, were eerily still. The Reverend's dogs had been sent out at dawn, their howls echoing through the cypress groves. But by noon, they returned whimpering, without a trace of their master's most loyal enforcer. Isaac watched from the shadows of the quarters as men searched the property. They scoured the barns, the swamps, even the riverbanks where the mist never lifted. But no one dared enter the tunnels beneath the main house. Not yet. The Reverend claimed they were sealed for a reason, that God's work was stored there. But the truth was that everyone feared what waited below. That afternoon, as the sun began to fade, a boy named Josiah, a field hand barely old enough to tie his own shoes, came running from the edge of the cane rows, shouting that he had found something. In his trembling hands, he carried a strip of cloth, stiff with dried blood. The overseer's insignia was still stitched into the corner. The Reverend dismissed it as an animal attack, but Ruth, who had come to tend to a sick child in the quarters, saw the fear in Isaac's eyes when she heard. Later that night, when the plantation had gone still, she found him waiting behind the smokehouse, a lantern burning low between them. He handed her a folded scrap of paper, torn from the back of a ledger. On it, drawn in faint charcoal, was the outline of a tunnel system. At the center of it, marked with an X, was a word scrawled in uneven letters. Below. Ruth frowned. Below what? She whispered. Isaac pointed toward the main house, then to the earth beneath their feet. He tapped twice on the ground, and she felt a hollow echo answer back. The next evening, a storm rolled in from the river. The sky turned the color of bruised metal, and lightning split the horizon in violent flashes. While the Reverend and his men secured the stables, Ruth slipped into the house under the cover of thunder. She moved through the dark halls, following the memory of a hidden stairway Isaac had once shown her, a narrow passage that descended behind the chapel room. At the bottom of the stairs, the air grew damp and cold. The scent of mold and something metallic, something like blood, clung to her lungs. She lifted her lantern, and the walls flickered to life with carvings, symbols etched deep into the stone, the same ones Isaac had drawn on his cabin wall. Circles within circles, eyes without pupils, and phrases written in a strange mix of English and Latin. Then she saw it, an iron door half buried in the mud. Its hinges were rusted, its surface marked by scratches that looked almost human. Beneath the grime, one word had been carved with deliberate care. Repent. Her hands trembled. She tried the handle, but it refused to move. When she pressed her ear against the door, she thought she heard something on the other side, a faint, rhythmic sound, like breathing, or maybe it was just the storm above. She turned to leave, but her lantern flickered, and in that brief sputter of light, she noticed something else, a piece of parchment pinned to the wall with a rusted nail. The edges were burned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Isaac's. It read only, "Do not trust the preacher. The dead are not sleeping." Ruth's pulse quickened. She tore the note from the wall, tucking it beneath her shawl, and fled up the stairs as thunder shook the house. When she emerged into the open air, the Reverend was standing by the door, rain running down his face, eyes burning with suspicion. "Storm's bad tonight," he said quietly, though his tone was far from casual. "Some things best left alone in weather like this." Ruth nodded, her heart pounding, the parchment burning against her chest. That night she couldn't sleep. The sound she had heard behind that iron door, if it was breathing, meant someone or something was alive down there. But the Reverend's words echoed in her mind, twisting into something darker. Some things best left alone. In the days that followed, Isaac's silence grew heavier. He no longer wrote on the walls. He no longer met her eyes. It was as if the act of giving her that map had drained something from him. But every night, when the wind howled through the fields, Ruth swore she could hear it again, the faint rhythm of breathing beneath the earth. And sometimes, if she listened long enough, she thought she heard something else too, a whisper. Her name. By the end of that week, fear had settled over the plantation like a fog that refused to lift. The Reverend's sermons grew longer, louder, almost desperate, as if he was preaching not to save souls, but to drown out something clawing at the edges of his mind. He told the workers that Hale's disappearance was divine punishment, that God had reclaimed what was unclean. But the slaves knew better. They had seen the blood-stained cloth, the way the Reverend's hands trembled when he mentioned Hale's name, and the shadows that moved behind the chapel walls long after midnight. Ruth felt the change most. The sick grew sicker, food rations tightened, and men were whipped for the smallest mistakes. Every act of cruelty was justified as restoring order. She wanted to leave, but she couldn't. Not while Isaac remained. Each time she visited, she found him thinner, more withdrawn, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. When she begged him to tell her what he'd found, he only pressed a single finger to his lips, then drew a circle in the dirt with a trembling hand. One evening, she caught sight of Nathaniel Moore watching her from the balcony. He looked pale, sleepless, his journal clutched to his chest. When their eyes met, he gave a subtle nod, as if to say, "I know." The next day, a folded note appeared beneath the door of Ruth's cabin. It contained only one line. "The tunnels go deeper than you think. My father keeps the keys beneath the altar." That same night, a punishment was announced. A young slave named Daniel had been accused of stealing cornmeal, a charge everyone knew was false. Reverend Moore made an example of him, ordering a whipping so severe that even his own men turned away. Isaac stood nearby, fists clenched, the whip's crack echoing like thunder in his skull. When it was over, he stepped forward, knelt beside Daniel's broken body, and pressed his palm to the earth. That simple gesture didn't go unnoticed. The Reverend shouted, "Get him away from there!" and struck Isaac across the face with the handle of his cane. Blood pooled in his mouth, but Isaac didn't move. He just looked up, his expression calm, almost knowing. That silence, the same silence that had once been a punishment, had become defiance. Later that night, Ruth went to Daniel's cabin with bandages and herbs. She found Isaac already there, tending to him with careful, deliberate hands. When she asked how he got there unnoticed, he showed her a hidden door behind the fireplace, a narrow passage leading underground. The air in the tunnel was cold and wet. Every sound seemed amplified. Dripping water, distant footsteps, the rustle of rats. The passage twisted beneath the house like veins of the earth, lined with rotting timber and old shackles still nailed to the walls. After several turns, they reached a small chamber lit by a single candle stub. On the floor lay objects that didn't belong there, small bones arranged in patterns, scraps of parchment covered in ink, and a tarnished cross inverted against the dirt. Ruth's breath caught. "What is this?" she whispered. Isaac pointed to the cross, then to the ceiling, where faint words were carved into the stone. "The price of purity is blood." Suddenly, everything began to make sense. The secret meetings, the missing slaves, the locked door marked "Repent." The Reverend's Circle of Redemption wasn't a church gathering. It was a ritual of control, a way to sanctify cruelty beneath the mask of holiness. The tunnels were not a sanctuary, they were a sacrificial ground. Ruth staggered back, shaking. "How many?" she managed to ask. "Two." Isaac picked up a small ledger from the floor and handed it to her. Inside were names, dates, and marks beside each one. Crosses for the dead, circles for the missing. The last page was blank except for one line written in Isaac's careful handwriting. 40, still breathing. She looked at him, horrified. Alive? Where? He pointed toward the passage that sloped further down, where the air grew heavier and the smell of decay thickened. But before they could move, footsteps echoed behind them. Isaac blew out the candle, plunging them into darkness. The Reverend's voice carried through the tunnel, cold and commanding. "If the Silent One is found down there," he said, "seal the door. Let him confess to God in the dark." The men's torches flickered closer. Ruth's hand found Isaac's, their hearts beating in unison. In that moment, she understood the scale of his defiance, not just against one man, but against an entire system built on silence and fear. And as they crouched in the blackness, surrounded by the weight of the earth and the whispers of the forgotten, Ruth knew the truth. Isaac's confession hadn't begun yet. It was still being written. The night the Reverend's men sealed the tunnel, a storm raged so violently that the river swelled over its banks and swallowed half the road to town. Lightning flashed through the shutters, illuminating faces twisted in fear. The plantation seemed to breathe, its old timbers creaking like ribs under pressure. Somewhere beneath that trembling house, Isaac and Ruth hid in the dark, pressed against the damp earth as footsteps thundered above. When the noise faded, Ruth lit a small scrap of cloth with the spark from a flint stone. The flickering flame cast long, ghostly shadows on the walls. That was when she saw them, the carvings, hundreds of them, faces etched into the stone, distorted and anguished, each one screaming without a mouth. Some bore symbols carved into their foreheads, crosses, circles, and strange runes that pulsed under the shifting light. "What is this place?" Ruth whispered. Her voice barely carried, but the echoes that answered didn't sound like her own. Isaac touched the wall, tracing one of the faces with his fingertips. Then he picked up a piece of broken slate lying in the dirt. Scratched into its surface were faint words. They prayed for light. The flame flickered again, and for the first time Ruth noticed the bones, not scattered, but stacked neatly along the edges of the chamber, forming a grim altar. Among them were remnants of clothing, fabric too fine to belong to slaves, silk, buttons engraved with initials, even a silver cufflink gleaming faintly in the dirt. "White men," Ruth murmured. "They killed their own." Isaac nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the far wall. There, half buried beneath the mud, was an iron grate. The air around it vibrated with a faint, rhythmic sound, steady, labored, human. Ruth dropped to her knees and pressed her ear against the metal. Her eyes widened. "Someone's down there!" Isaac gripped the bars and pulled, his muscles straining, veins rising like cords in his neck. The rust groaned, but the lock held firm. Ruth reached for a nearby stone and began to strike at the hinges, the sound echoing like gunfire in the cramped space. Finally, with a metallic shriek, the grate gave way, and the smell that poured out was thick, rotting, unbearable. She gagged, covering her mouth, but Isaac crawled forward through the narrow opening, vanishing into the blackness below. For several heartbeats, Ruth heard nothing, then a faint tap. 2 short knocks, his signal that it was safe. She followed, her hands sliding over slick walls as she descended into a space colder and wetter than anything she'd imagined. When her feet touched solid ground again, she realized she was standing in water. The light from her makeshift torch reflected off the surface, revealing what at first looked like rows of sleeping bodies. But as she stepped closer, she saw the truth. They weren't sleeping. Dozens of figures were chained to the walls, men, women, even children. Their eyes fluttered weakly in the light, their skin ghost-pale from months in darkness. Some murmured prayers, others simply stared. And on the floor beside them lay empty plates, rusted shackles, and the remains of others who hadn't survived long enough to see rescue. Ruth dropped to her knees, her hands trembling. My God! They're alive! Isaac moved among them silently, cutting chains with a rusted blade he'd found near the grate. The captives recoiled at first, terrified of another trick, until Ruth whispered, "You're free now. You're free." But that word, free, felt dangerous down there. The walls seemed to reject it. Somewhere deeper in the tunnels, something stirred. A low, metallic groan, followed by the slow drip of water. Then faintly, a sound neither of them could explain. A soft scraping, like someone dragging metal across stone. Isaac froze. He lifted the torch toward the sound, and for a heartbeat the flame caught the edge of movement, something human-shaped disappearing behind a wall. Ruth's breath caught. We're not alone. They turned to lead the captives upward, but one of them, a boy no older than 10, tugged at Ruth's skirt and pointed to the far end of the chamber. There, carved into the rock, were words smeared in what looked like dried blood. He comes when the light returns. Before she could speak, the torch sputtered out, plunging them into total darkness. In that moment, the tunnel seemed to come alive. Chains rattled, voices whispered, and somewhere far above, a door slammed shut. Isaac struck the flint desperately until a spark finally caught, and for an instant, the flame revealed a shadow standing in the archway, a figure wearing the torn remnants of a preacher's robe, its face half hidden, its hand clutching a blood-stained Bible. The captives screamed. Ruth dragged Isaac toward the exit, her pulse hammering in her ears. But as they fled, she heard a voice rise from the dark, calm, commanding, and unmistakable. "Repent," it said. "The Lord is still watching." The voice of Reverend Elijah Moore. But the Reverend was supposed to be upstairs. When Ruth and Isaac finally burst out of the tunnel and into the open night, the storm had passed. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of wet soil and burnt wood. Smoke curled above the plantation house, its upper floor engulfed in flames. For a moment, they thought justice had come at last. But as the freed captives gathered behind them, trembling and blind from years in the dark, Ruth realized something was terribly wrong. The fire burned too cleanly. No screams, no chaos, just fire, controlled, deliberate. Isaac's eyes followed the line of footprints leading away from the house, dozens of them pressed deep into the mud, not slaves, boots, the kind soldiers wore. "They knew," he said under his breath. "They were here before us." Before Ruth could answer, a faint sound cut through the air. The toll of a bell. Not the church bell from the plantation chapel. This one came from deep within the woods, slow and deliberate, like a summons. The freed captives stirred uneasily, whispering prayers. Isaac looked to the horizon, where faint lights flickered between the trees. They followed the sound through the dripping forest until they reached the edge of an overgrown cemetery. Graves leaned sideways under the weight of years, their inscriptions faded and cracked. At the center stood a small wooden chapel, half rotted, its steeple broken in two, but the bell above it swung gently, Though no wind stirred, Ruth felt the hair on her arms rise. "He's still here," she whispered. Inside the chapel, the air was stifling. The pews were coated in soot, the altar splintered. On the wall behind it hung a massive painting of the Last Judgment, but all the faces had been scratched out, every angel, every sinner erased with violent strokes. Only the figure of Christ remained untouched, though his eyes had been blackened with ash. Isaac stepped forward, his foot striking something metallic. A chain. One end was bolted to the altar, the other was empty. As he bent to examine it, Ruth's gaze fell upon a book resting open beside a melted candle. A Bible. But its pages were filled with something else entirely. Written in neat, measured script were confessions. Dates, names, punishments. The handwriting matched the reverends. Yet the confessions didn't belong to the enslaved. They were from white men, officials, overseers, and church members, all describing the same ritual, sealing the unclean beneath the earth to purify their souls through suffering. But one entry stood out, the last page, dated the night before the fire. The mute boy wrote his truth. His words unbound the damned. The Lord demands balance. 40 will rise, 40 will burn. Only one may speak their name. Ruth felt her stomach twist. The mute boy, Isaac. Isaac froze. He turned slowly toward her, confusion etched across his face. What? Before she could respond, the bell tolled again, this time from directly above them. Dust rained from the rafters. The sound was deafening, impossible for such a small structure. Then, from behind the altar, a door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairway descending into darkness. Ruth raised her torch. "We can't go back," she said. Isaac hesitated, glancing at the captives outside, then at the book, still open on the altar. Something about the Reverend's final words echoed in his mind. Only one may speak their name. He touched his throat, the place where no voice had ever formed. And for the first time, Ruth saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of what was below, but fear of what he might remember if they kept going. The wind howled through the shattered windows, carrying the faint sound of crying, low, childlike, coming from the stairs. Ruth gripped the torch tighter and stepped forward. But when she looked back, Isaac wasn't behind her anymore. He stood frozen in front of the painting, staring at the blackened eyes of Christ. His lips moved soundlessly, shaping words he couldn't say. Then, suddenly, the bell stopped. Silence fell so abruptly it felt suffocating. And in that silence, the painting's surface rippled, just once, like breath passing beneath the canvas. Then a voice, faint and distant, rose from the open Bible on the altar. He was never mute. He was made silent. The flame flickered. Ruth's grip trembled. The new enigma was clear. Isaac's silence was not a condition. It was a curse. Ruth stood frozen at the top of the stairway, the torchlight flickering against the walls of the decaying chapel. The words still echoed in her mind. He was never mute. He was made silent. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest as she turned back to Isaac, but he was gone. The air where he had stood moments ago seemed heavier, colder, as if it had swallowed him whole. Taking a deep breath, she descended. Each step groaned under her weight, and the smell of damp earth grew thicker. The tunnel below was lined with wooden beams charred from fire, but beneath the soot, symbols were etched, crosses, circles, and strange markings resembling chains. As she ran her fingers across them, she realized they weren't random carvings. They were letters, a message. She wiped away the grime and read aloud. They buried truth, not bodies. The tunnel widened into a crypt-like chamber. The floor was covered in bones, hundreds, maybe thousands, but these weren't laid to rest. They were arranged in deliberate patterns, forming spirals that converged on the center, where a wooden chest sat untouched by rot or flame. Its surface gleamed with gold leaf, engraved with the same symbols from the walls. Ruth knelt beside it. A rusted lock hung from the latch, snapped in two. Someone had already opened it, long ago. Inside she found scrolls sealed with wax, their ribbons blackened but intact. One by one she unrolled them, her eyes widening with every word. They were not confessions, they were transactions, ledgers of human lives. The reverend and local officials had been secretly selling enslaved people to other plantations, even after the law forbade it, disguising the trade as atonement rituals. Those who vanished into the tunnels had not died there. They were shipped away under new names. And among the documents, a single letter stood apart, written in elegant cursive. Its signature sent a chill through her body. To Reverend Solomon Haynes, your silence regarding the state's involvement shall be rewarded. The mute boy must not speak, for his words hold the names of every man profiting from this sanctified deceit. The signature read, Governor James LeClaire. Ruth staggered backward. The governor, the man who publicly preached liberation and faith, had orchestrated the trade himself. The reverend had been his partner, binding the slaves to secrecy through religious terror. Isaac hadn't been born mute. His tongue had been cut to keep him from revealing the governor's crimes. A scraping sound echoed behind her. She turned sharply. The wall she'd entered through was shifting. The bones on the ground trembled, rearranging themselves as if pulled by invisible strings. In the glow of her torch, she saw something horrifying. Beneath the layers of remains lay writing, drawn in dark ink across the very floor. Not ink, blood, preserved by the cold of the earth. The words formed a prayer. 40 shall burn, so that 40 may live. The voice of the silenced will unchain the bound. Ruth dropped the torch in shock. The flames danced across the words, illuminating something she hadn't seen before. Another tunnel branching off to the side, smaller, narrower. Inside, dozens of small wooden tablets were pinned to the wall. Each bore a name carved with a trembling hand. At the very end of the row, one name glowed faintly in the firelight. Isaac. And beneath it, a single sentence. He wrote what others dared not say. Her breath caught. She reached out and touched the carved letters, and suddenly the memory came flooding back. The old stories, the rumors of a hidden journal found decades later, filled with names and confessions that brought powerful men to ruin. The mute slave's words, Isaac's writings. It wasn't just legend, it was here, buried beneath their feet. The journal that freed 40 captives wasn't written by a savior priest, but by a silenced boy who defied the men who mutilated him. A gust of wind roared through the crypt, snuffing out the flame. In the darkness, Ruth heard whispers, voices, countless and overlapping, speaking in unison. He spoke for us. Then one voice broke through the others. It was Isaac's. They will come for you now. Light exploded through the cracks in the tunnel walls, blinding and searing. The bones around her began to shift again, forming shapes, not symbols this time, but faces. Dozens of faces staring up at her, waiting, pleading. Ruth clutched the journal to her chest and ran toward the faint glimmer of moonlight ahead. As she climbed out into the night, she realized what the Reverend and the governor had feared most. Not the revolt of slaves, but the survival of truth. And somewhere, beyond the trees, she thought she saw Isaac standing by the bell tower, watching in silence. No longer cursed, but finally heard. The night had fallen utterly silent when Ruth emerged from the earth, clutching the journal against her chest. Her hands were blackened with soot and blood, her breath ragged. Behind her, the entrance to the tunnel smoldered as if the very ground had begun to reject its secrets. She looked toward the burning ruins of the plantation, flames licking at the horizon like the fingers of a dying god. And she finally understood. The fire hadn't been meant to destroy the slaves. It had been meant to destroy the truth. She stumbled toward the bell tower, the only structure still standing untouched. The sound of the bell had ceased, yet its echo seemed to hum within her skull, guiding her forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the knowledge of what she carried. Inside those pages lay the voices of 40 souls condemned to silence, and the handwriting of the men who had condemned them. At the tower's base, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and metal. The great iron bell hung above her, motionless, yet faintly trembling as if stirred by an unseen hand. Beneath it stood Isaac, his figure barely visible in the gloom. He turned as she approached, his face illuminated by the faint orange glow from the distant fire. His eyes, once soft and uncertain, now held something ancient, something that remembered too much. Ruth raised the journal. "It's all here," she whispered. "The governor, the reverend, every name. We can bring this to light." Isaac shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. He touched his throat, then gestured toward the bell. She frowned, stepping closer. "You want me to ring it?" He nodded once. The thought chilled her. The bell had told through every horror that had unfolded here, through the sealing of tunnels, through the burnings, through the confessions written in blood. Yet Isaac's eyes were pleading, not warning. She hesitated, then pulled the heavy rope. The sound that erupted was unlike anything she had ever heard, not a toll, but a scream of iron and air, vibrating through her bones. The ground trembled, birds exploded from the trees, fleeing into the darkness, and then the air shifted. From the fields, from the tunnels, from the ashes of the house, shapes began to rise, figures made of smoke and dust, faint outlines of bodies, walking slowly toward the tower. They came without sound, without breath. The freed captives who had escaped earlier fell to their knees, crying out prayers, terrified and awestruck. Ruth turned back to Isaac. He stood beneath the bell, his head bowed. The journal in her hands began to glow faintly, its ink bleeding into the paper like fresh wounds reopening. The words rearranged themselves across the pages. She watched in horror as the letters formed a single phrase over and over. "Let them speak." She looked back at Isaac and saw that tears streamed down his face. But this time, when his lips parted, a sound emerged, not the cracked whisper of a man reclaiming his voice, but dozens of voices, overlapping, echoing, alive. They spoke in harmony, every word trembling with sorrow and rage. "We were buried beneath the word of God, but our truth was never his." The air around them roared. The tower shook violently, dust raining from the beams. The spirits that had risen from the fields gathered around, circling Isaac as their collective voices filled the night. Ruth fell to her knees, shielding her face as light erupted from the journal. The pages turned rapidly on their own until they stopped at one final entry, one that hadn't been there before. The handwriting was Isaac's. "I confess to the murder of the Reverend Solomon Haynes. I confess not for sin, but for justice. His death was the price of silence. Let my words be their freedom." The light dimmed, and for a moment everything was still. Then the tower bell gave one final thunderous toll and shattered. The sound echoed across the valley like thunder, and the spirits began to dissolve, their forms unraveling into the wind. When Ruth finally looked up, Isaac was gone. Only the journal remained where he had stood, its cover warm beneath her trembling hands. She opened it one last time and found a new passage written across the inside cover in uneven script. "The 40 live because one voice dared to write." In that moment, the flames consuming the plantation began to die, fading into smoke that drifted toward the stars. The first light of dawn touched the horizon, revealing a landscape scarred but cleansed, as if the land itself had been purged of a centuries-old curse. Ruth stood, her tears mixing with ash. Around her, the surviving captives watched in silence, faces illuminated by the faintest trace of morning gold. Isaac had freed them, not through words spoken, but through the truth written in defiance. The journal was more than evidence, it was the breath of the dead restored. Ruth held it high, her voice trembling as she spoke to the others. This is not the story they wanted us to remember. It's the one they tried to burn. The captives bowed their heads. For the first time, the wind that swept through the fields carried no whispers, only peace. And as Ruth turned to leave the ruins, she heard a faint sound behind her, the distant ring of a bell, not of iron, but of light. A final echo from the boy who had never truly been silent. The morning that followed was neither calm nor bright. The land lay wounded beneath a pale sun, its silence heavy, almost sacred. Smoke still rose in thin grey ribbons from the ruins of the plantation, twisting upward like ghosts reluctant to leave. Ruth stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, clutching the journal that had survived fire, blood, and betrayal. Its pages fluttered in the wind, whispering, it seemed, with voices of those who had finally been heard. She thought of Isaac, of the boy whose silence had once seemed like weakness, but was in truth the greatest rebellion of all. He had written what others feared to speak. He had turned his pain into a weapon sharper than any blade, and his truth had broken the chains of 40 souls. Yet what haunted Ruth most was not his sacrifice, but what it revealed about the world that silenced him. History, she realized, was not built by the righteous. It was written by the powerful, men who dressed cruelty in the robes of faith, who hid their greed behind scripture. The governor, the reverend, the planters, all had shaped their own gospel of obedience, rewriting the word of God to justify the profit of suffering. And yet, one mute slave had undone them all. Ruth looked down at the journal again. Its ink had faded in places, but every word pulsed with life, confessions, ledgers, and names carved into eternity. This was not a relic of the past. It was a mirror, and in that mirror she saw the same shadows lingering in her own time. Silence forced upon the powerless, truth buried beneath wealth, the illusion that progress could erase the crimes of memory. She knelt beside the earth and opened the journal to the final page. Isaac's confession. Let my words be their freedom. Those words struck her like a prayer, not a plea to heaven, but a command to the living. Remember, speak, refuse, silence. Ruth tore a single page from the book and buried it in the soil where the tunnels once ran. The rest she wrapped carefully and pressed against her chest. The dead have spoken, she whispered, but the living must keep telling their story. A gust of wind swept through the field, stirring the ashes into motion. The charred remains of the bell tower glimmered faintly under the sun, and for a fleeting second Ruth thought she heard it ring again, not in mourning, but in remembrance. As she began her walk down the hill, she saw the freed captives gathered near the riverbank. Some were singing in low, trembling voices, not hymns of the church, but songs of their own, rising from a place no master could reach. Their melody wove through the valley, soft but unyielding, carrying with it the weight of centuries. Ruth stopped and listened. Each note was a heartbeat of the past, each voice a promise that silence would no longer rule. The truth Isaac had written would travel, perhaps slowly, perhaps dangerously, but it would endure. History would try to bury it again, she knew. Men would deny it, twist it, call it legend, but every generation would find it anew, because truth once spoken, or written in defiance, cannot be killed. She turned once more to the smoking ruins, and felt a strange peace settle over her. The cruelty that had built this place was gone, consumed by its own fire. What remained was something indestructible. Memory, carved not in stone, but in conscience. As the wind carried the last of the smoke toward the horizon, Ruth whispered to the absent boy whose words had changed everything. You are not forgotten, Isaac. None of you are. The light caught the ashes mid-air, scattering them like glittering dust. And in that shimmer, Ruth saw what history truly was. not ink on paper, not sermons or monuments, but the faint, persistent glow of those who refused to vanish. Their silence had ended, and from that silence, truth had begun to speak. If you've stayed with this story until now, you already know. This wasn't just a tale of horror or mystery. It was a confession written by history itself. A reminder that silence can be more violent than any weapon, and that truth, when finally spoken, echoes for centuries. Think for a moment, how many stories like Isaac's were buried, not by time, but by choice? How many names were erased? How many truths rewritten so the powerful could keep their hands clean? The journal may have burned, the plantations may have fallen, but the silence they built still lingers in the world around us. So I want to ask you something. What would you have done if you had found that journal? Would you have opened it, knowing that its words could destroy everything you were taught to believe? Type below, "I would open it." Because stories like this one deserve to be faced, not hidden. And tell me, do you believe Isaac was cursed by others, or by the truth he carried? Was his silence forced or chosen so that his final words would mean more than any scream ever could? I want to read your thoughts in the comments. Let's see what this community believes, because the truth of history is built when voices rise together. If you felt the weight of this story, if it stirred something inside you, the sense that the past is still alive beneath our feet, then subscribe right now, because this isn't the end of our journey. Every week, we uncover another hidden corner of history's dark heart. Stories the world tried to forget, and voices that demand to be remembered. And if you've been here before, you know this part. Those who stay until the end always receive something special. The bonus truth. Here it is. The bell that rang the night Isaac died. They say it was never found in the ruins, but decades later, when new workers rebuilt the church, they unearthed a hollow in the earth beneath the altar. Inside it was a single bronze shard, engraved with one phrase: "The silence was never mine." If that gives you chills, you're in the right place. Subscribe, hit the bell, and join the ones who listen where history still whispers. The wind had quieted, and the valley lay still beneath the grey morning sky. Ruth stood alone where the plantation once burned, the journal pressed against her chest, the last voice of those who had been silenced. Around her, the ashes drifted softly, carried by a breeze that seemed to breathe their names. For the first time, the air felt lighter, as though the land itself had exhaled after centuries of holding its breath. She looked toward the horizon, where the faint outline of the bell tower stood like a broken monument. Somewhere within that ruin, Isaac's spirit lingered, not trapped, but watching, waiting, ensuring that the truth he died for would never fade. Ruth whispered into the silence, "Your voice will keep speaking, through us, through every story that refuses to die." And perhaps, somewhere deep in the earth, the bell answered her, a faint hum, too soft for the ear, but enough for the soul to feel. Ruth began to walk, leaving footprints across the field where the tunnels once ran. Behind her, the dawn spread across the sky like spilled gold, and the shadows of the past began to dissolve into light. She didn't know where she was headed next, but she carried with her the only thing that mattered, the truth, because in the end, every buried story demands to rise again, and the world, whether ready or not, must listen. As she disappeared down the long dirt road, the camera would linger on the ruins. The wind would lift the ashes one last time, and in their drifting shapes, faint outlines of faces could almost be seen, smiling, watching, free. Their silence had ended, but another whisper from another time was already forming on the horizon. Because history never truly rests. Every truth uncovered leaves another one trembling beneath it, waiting for the next soul brave enough to dig deeper. And that's where our next story begins. A tale buried in the heart of Europe. a convent where the walls still bleed during storms, and the portraits of long-dead nuns change their expression overnight. Locals call it the Weeping Monastery. Historians say it's just moisture and decay. But those who've heard the crying behind its chapel doors know better. What if the paintings aren't changing, but trying to speak? If you've walked this far with us, you already know. Every echo from the past carries a warning, and every unanswered mystery hides a truth too dangerous to forget. So stay with us. The next story will take you where history and horror become one, where faith, guilt, and vengeance intertwine under candlelight. Until then, remember, some voices are not meant to be silenced, and once you've heard them, you'll never listen to history the same way again.